The morning was still and crisp, the kind of quiet that feels sacred just before the world begins to stir. The frost-covered grass sparkled beneath the rising sun, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out against the cold. My daughter Sophie laughed as she rolled across the backyard in her wheelchair, her blanket tucked neatly around her legs, her hand clutching Daisy's leash, the golden retriever tugging playfully at the end with her usual gentle enthusiasm. Daisy barked once, twice, then bolted ahead, not too far, always careful, always circling back. Sophie's face was lit with joy, the kind of joy that only ever existed when Daisy was near. Then it happened. A sharp crack shattered the air. Sophie screamed. I dropped my coffee, and Ranny ran so fast I didn't feel the frozen ground beneath my feet, my heart pounding louder than the echoes of the gunshot. She was on the ground, curled around Daisy, blood smeared across her sleeve, her fingers trembling, her voice a broken whisper. No, no. No, I dropped beside them. Daisy wasn't moving. My world tilted and fell apart. She was gone. Daisy was gone. My daughter sobbed against her fur, crying in a way that carved wounds into the air. I couldn't breathe. Who did this? I whispered more to myself than anyone else who in the hell did this. Then I heard it, voices, male voices, laughing on the edge of our woods. Two men in camouflage rifles slung over their shoulders. Their boots muddy from my land. I stood and marched toward them, rage making every step faster. You're on private property. I shouted, my voice cracking with fury. You shot our dog. You shot my daughter's therapy. Dog. They looked up. One of them smirked. We had permission. Buddy, he said, blame your HOA president. Not us. My chest tightened. Kerren. Course, it was Kerren. She had been a thorn in my side since the day we moved in. The self-appointed queen of our gated community. Always watching, always judging, always waiting for a reason to strike. This wasn't just a mistake. This was war. I left Sophie, crying over Daisy, and stormed straight to Kerren's house every step, like thunder in my ears, every breath a struggle not to scream. She was already outside, as if she knew what was coming, coffee cup in hand, smugness painted across her face, like it was her birthright. You let hunters onto my land, I snapped, pointing toward the woods. They killed my daughter's therapy dog. She raised an eyebrow. Your dog shouldn't have been running around out there, she said, cool as ice. This is hunting season. That's private land. I said it belongs to me. I have the deed. She sipped her coffee, unfazed. Well, maybe next time, keep your mutt inside. I stood there shaking, unable to believe what I was hearing. She didn't care. She didn't even flinch. She turned and walked. Back inside as if we were nothing, as if my daughter's pain didn't exist. I walked back home every step heavier than the last. Sophie hadn't moved, still wrapped around Daisy. Her sobs quieter, now her eyes empty. That night, she didn't eat. She didn't speak. She didn't sleep. I sat beside her bed, listening to the silence and hating it, because Daisy used to fill that silence with soft breathing, with warmth, with peace. Now the silence was unbearable. The next morning I called, the HOA demanded, to speak with someone, anyone who would listen. They passed me from one line to the next, until finally someone said Kerren had authorized regulated seasonal hunting. There's no such policy, I told them. It's my land, not HOA land. You can't give permission for this. We're not liable, sir, the voice on the phone replied. She acted independently. Please direct any concerns to local law enforcement. So I did. The sheriff listened, politely, took notes, nodded a lot, then said, "Unless I could prove the thief. Hunters intended to kill the dog. There was nothing he could do. Civil matter," he said, "not criminal. She was a therapy dog. I told him she helped my daughter live again after the accident. She wasn't just a pet." He nodded again, but the answer didn't change. I hung up the phone and stared at my hands, unsure what to do next, unsure how to fight back against something so cruel and so calculated. Later that day, I walked the property line, found boot prints clear as day, crossing into our woods near. Where Daisy had fallen, beside them fresh shotgun shells, bright red against the snow. I collected them, put them in a bag, labeled them, marked the date, the time, the location. But even then, I knew evidence only matters when someone cares enough to see. I buried Daisy in the backyard under the oak tree where she and Sophie used to sit in the summer. I laid her favorite squeaky toy beside her, the one she always brought to Sophie's feet when the nightmares got bad. Sophie didn't come out to say goodbye. I didn't ask her to. I sat by that grave until the sky turned dark, until the cold seeped into my bones. And still, I didn't move. I had never felt so helpless, so utterly defeated. Kerren had trespassed, ignored property lines, endangered my child, and walked away with a smirk on her face. She thought she was untouchable. Maybe she was, but as I stood up and looked toward her house, a fire started in my chest, something deeper than anger, something sharper than grief. This wasn't over, it was just beginning. Before heading forward in the story, I will request you to please subscribe my channel. Thank you. The next morning, Sophie stared out the window, her eyes dull and lifeless, her fingers tracing slow circles on the glass. I placed a plate of pancakes on the table beside her, but she didn't even look. She hasn't spoken since it happened. I told my brother over the phone. Yesterday, she cried today. She's just silent. He paused, then said, "Maybe she's trying to hold herself together in the only way she can, maybe. She's afraid if she talks, she'll fall apart." I looked at her and felt the truth of that settle deep in my bones. Outside, our yard was quiet again, too quiet, without the sound of Daisy's tags jingling or the soft bark that usually greeted the mailman. But I wasn't quiet. I was burning inside. Kerren thought she could control everyone with her fake smile and forged authority. She used the HOA like a weapon, not a community. She passed out fines for garden gnomes, enforced lawn heights, banned holiday lights, all while playing friendly to those who bowed to her rules. I had never bowed. I had challenged her at meetings. I had voted against her initiatives. I had spoken up when others stayed silent. And now, she had found a way to strike. Back, I walked the neighborhood that afternoon, knocking on doors, speaking to neighbors, most of whom kept their voices low and their doors half shut. When I told them what happened, most looked down, looked away. But not all. The Mitchells on Hawthorne Lane said they'd had run-ins with Kerren, too. She fined them $500 for a trampoline in their backyard, claimed it was a safety hazard, even though no HOA rule existed about it. The Thompsons, 2 blocks down, had cameras that caught her snooping. In their backyard, while they were at work, she claimed she was checking for compliance, but no one had given her access. Every story painted the same picture. Kerren had built a tiny kingdom and ruled it with fear. That night, I sat at my desk, pulled out every HOA document, every bylaw, every meeting minute I could find. I highlighted notes, made copies, took pictures, anything that might show a pattern of abuse. Then I looked into the hunters. A quick search of the local hunting forum showed one of them, bragging about a private neighborhood with woods full of deer and no patrols. No tags were logged, no permits filed, and still the sheriff shrugged. I needed a new angle. Kerren loved rules. She lived by them, enforced them, weaponized them. What if I could prove she broke one? The next morning, I walked the perimeter of her property, phone in hand. Recording 10 feet past her backyard was a small shed made of metal, hidden behind hedges and vines, and absolutely not allowed per HOA Code Section 12. Article 3, which banned permanent structures outside the defined lot footprint. A structure that size needed board approval permits and neighbor notification. She had none of it. I snapped pictures, took video, and sent it anonymously to the board. Then I visited city zoning turns. Kerren never registered the shed with them either, and that was a separate fine entirely. The pieces were beginning to move. I didn't stop there. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early, stood by the door as neighbors, filed in. I didn't speak. I just handed out printed flyers, listing her violations side by side, with quotes from the bylaws and small photos of the illegal shed. No emotion, just facts. When Kerren entered, she froze for a half second, then plastered on her practiced smile and walked to the front like she owned the room, but the room had changed. Whispers filled the air, people looking at papers instead of their phones, glancing toward me, then toward her. She banged the gavel, called the meeting to order, her voice slightly sharper than usual, her eyes flicking toward me. Then away. First on the agenda was Community Cleanup Day. I raised my hand, she frowned, then nodded slowly. I said I had questions about property compliance, specifically about structures built without approval, and if exceptions were being made for certain residents. A few people murmured. She said that was not the time or place to discuss personal grievances. I said I wasn't discussing grievances, just policy. Then I handed a copy of my flyer to every board member and asked it be entered into record. Kerren's face turned red. She tried to cut me off, but I kept speaking calmly, steadily, quoting from the bylaws page by page, listing how she'd violated at least 3 sections, and possibly more depending on zoning review. The room was dead silent. I finished by saying that if enforcement was only for residents who disagreed with her, then perhaps it was time we looked into electing someone new, someone who followed the same rules. She enforced. Kerren stood there, jaw-clenched fingers gripping the podium, like it was the only thing holding her up. Meeting adjourned, she snapped, slamming the gavel down. People filed out slower than usual, still whispering, still looking. I walked home, feeling a flicker of something I hadn't felt in days. Hope. It wasn't revenge yet, but it was a beginning. I passed Sophie's room. Her light was on, but she hadn't come out. I knocked gently, then stepped inside. She sat on her bed holding a framed photo of Daisy, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. I sat beside her, said nothing for a long time, just watched the photo with her. She finally whispered. She was the only one who knew when I was sad. I know I said, but I promise you, they're not going to get away with it. Kerren stopped waving at people after that meeting. She stopped walking, her dog passed our house, stopped pretending to be neighborly, stopped pretending altogether. I knew I had her attention now, and that was exactly what I wanted. The next week I met with 3 neighbors in my garage, the Mitchells and Jordan. From the next cul-de-sac they brought notes, emails, letters, all documenting years of harassment and questionable rule enforcement from Kerren Jordan had a fine for planting a lemon tree. Even though the HOA guidebook said nothing about fruit trees, he'd appealed twice, and both times Kerren had rejected him directly, even though she wasn't supposed to handle appeals alone. The Mitchells had video proof of Kerren yelling at their babysitter through their Ring camera, accusing her of loitering while she waited for them to return from the grocery store. Each story added another crack in the perfect image she crafted, and I was going to tear that image down. Brick by brick, I uploaded everything to a private site, complete with dates, names, screenshots, and a counter of violations. I called it The Truth Behind the Gate. I kept it anonymous at first, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted her to wonder. I wanted her to guess, and she did. 2 days after it went live, she called an emergency board meeting. She looked pale, her smile too tight, her voice brittle as she said the board would be investigating the source of misinformation and harassment aimed at the community president. She looked around the room as if daring someone to admit it. No one did. The truth was out, and it had a life of its own. Now neighbors started emailing screenshots around, talking quietly in their driveways, questioning things they'd never dared to before. Received 5 messages that night from people I barely knew, all thanking me, asking how they could help. One of them was a former board member who said Kerren forced her out last year after she questioned a budget discrepancy. That budget discrepancy led me to something bigger. The HOA accounts showed monthly maintenance charges for common areas, landscaping, trash pickup. But I noticed the numbers changed erratically. 1 month, 2,000, the next 400, then back again. The vendors were always listed as initials, not names, so I dug deeper. Those initials matched a company registered under Kerren's cousin's name, an LLC with no real website, just a P.O. box and a disconnected phone line. She was funneling money, not a lot, but enough to. Notice enough to hurt her if the right people saw it. I compiled the findings into a report complete with copies of the filings, invoices, and screenshots of the LLC registration, then sent it to the HOA board anonymously and to the city zoning office, and to the local news tip line, just for good measure. The fallout was fast. Within 48 hours, there was a board vote to suspend. Kerren pending investigation. She screamed at the meeting, red-faced veins in her neck bulging, accusing everyone of betrayal and slander. When that didn't work, she tried threats. She came to my door 2 nights later, just after dark, her hair frizzy, her hands trembling from either rage or fear, or both. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and waited. She stared at me, eyes wild. "You think you're clever," she hissed. "You think this will end the way you want." I said, "I think it's already ending." She said, "You ruined me." I said, "No, you did that yourself." She said, "You'll regret this." I said, "Not as much as you'll regret." Underestimating me, she stormed off into the night, and I didn't follow. The next morning, Sophie asked if she could visit Daisy's grave for the first time since it happened. I wheeled her out to the oak tree, and we sat there in silence. She placed a drawing on the small stone marker, a picture of Daisy with wings and a halo, and the words, "Best friend forever." Her voice was soft but sure. She said, "I want her to know I'm okay." I said, "I think she already does." We sat until the wind picked up, and the sky began to dim. When we went back inside, there was a letter on our doorstep, folded once sealed with no name. Inside was a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. I didn't know what she had done. "I am so sorry." It was unsigned, but I recognized the script. It was from one of the hunters, the one who hadn't smirked, the one who had looked away when I shouted at them in the woods. The guilt had gotten to him. Good 2 days later, I received a message from the local news. They were running a story on HOA corruption and wanted to interview me anonymously. I agreed only if they blurred my voice and face and kept Sophie out of it. The segment aired that Friday. Kerren's face was blurred too, but everyone knew it was her. The footage showed the shed, the forged signatures, the invoice patterns, the anonymous testimonials played over images of pristine suburban streets and white fences. The story ended with the anchor saying authorities were now investigating several members of the HOA leadership for financial misconduct and potential zoning violations. That was the first night I slept through, without waking up since the day Daisy died. But it wasn't the end. The city had questions. The board had questions, and Kerren had no answers. They froze. The HOA accounts called a special election and announced that all fines issued in the last 2 years were suspended. Pending review, neighbors walked by our house and nodded, waved, smiled small things, but they meant everything. Kerren disappeared from the neighborhood. For 3 days, no one saw her car. No one saw her walking her dog. No one saw her pretending to care. Then she came back, and she brought company a lawyer, in a pressed suit, carrying a briefcase and a sour expression. I watched from the window, and I knew she was going to try to sue me, and that meant she was desperate. Good, let her try. The papers arrived on a Thursday afternoon, handed to me by a process server in a crisp gray suit, who offered a tight smile and said, "Just doing my job." I opened the envelope and read the words, defamation, damages, emotional distress, and slander. The irony so thick, I nearly laughed. Kerren was suing me for exposing the truth. I sat at the kitchen table, Sophie drawing at the counter beside me, and read every word of the complaint twice, once as a father and once as a man who had nothing left to fear. She was trying to silence me, to scare me back into the shadows where she controlled the narrative. But she had forgotten something crucial. I had already lost everything she could take. And that made me dangerous. I contacted a friend from college, now AE, lawyer specializing in civil litigation. He read the complaint and chuckled, said, "This won't hold up in court, not with the paper trail, not with the emails, not with the money funneling, not with the dog, especially not with the dog he offered to represent. Me pro bono." I accepted. And then I got to work first. I made a call to the local animal advocacy group, told them the story, sent them Sophie's drawing, sent them the photos of Daisy, her vest, her certificates, her smiling beside my daughter, on her best days. The organization posted it on their socials with a call to action. The post went viral in less than 24 hours. Thousands of comments, hundreds of shares. Local news picked it up again, this time with Sophie's permission. Her voice clear. As she told the anchor, Daisy was her best friend, and she didn't understand why someone would let people hurt her on purpose. That clip broke hearts and lit fires. People rallied. A protest formed outside the HOA building. People holding signs with Daisy's name, with pictures of her, with Sophie, with quotes from the bylaws Kerren had violated. They chanted, "Justice for Daisy," and "Sophie deserves peace," and "Enough is enough." Kerren stayed inside. When she tried to drive out, someone filmed her behind the wheel windows up as she refused to look at the crowd. Her face pale, her mouth tight. The footage hit the internet that night, and the meme storm began. They dubbed her Kerren the Dog Destroyer, Queen of HOA, Hell the Meme, Mother of Malice, one viral. Video showed side-by-side clips of her smiling at past HOA meetings, followed by her storming out of the boardroom, red-faced and silent. Then came the public meeting. It was mandatory, a city hearing on zoning violations and public trust. I arrived. Early brought Sophie with me. She held my hand tightly, but her chin was lifted, her eyes steady. The room filled fast. Reporters, residents, activists, city officials, even a few people who had stayed quiet before, now sat in the front row. Kerren entered, last flanked by her lawyer, dressed in a sharp navy blazer, her eyes scanning the crowd like a queen entering enemy territory. The hearing began with the chair reading off the list of infractions from illegal structures to financial mismanagement. To breach of fiduciary duty, Kerren's lawyer objected to nearly everything. The chair overruled, each time citing evidence documentation, video proof. Then they opened the floor. I stood, walked to the podium, and took a breath. I spoke of Sophie, of Daisy, of the night the gunshot split the trees, and my little girl screamed for her best friend, of the weeks of silence, of the grief so heavy it nearly crushed us. I spoke of the patterns, the punishments, the manipulation, the fear I said Kerren had created, a system that protected her while hurting everyone else, and I wasn't the first to suffer under it, just the last. When I finished, Sophie stood beside me. She didn't say much, just, she was my dog, and she helped me feel brave. The room went silent. The chair nodded, thanked her, then called the next speaker. By the end of the hearing, 3 more residents had spoken against Kerren, all with stories, all with proof. The board held a vote right there in public. The results unanimous. Kerren was removed from the HOA effective immediately. The crowd erupted in applause. But that wasn't all. The city issued her fines for code violations, thousands in penalties. Her cousin's business was flagged for investigation, and the HOA accounts were frozen pending a full audit. Kerren tried to leave without speaking, but the cameras were waiting, and the reporters didn't move. She tried to cover her face with a scarf, but someone shouted, "Tell the little girl why you let them kill her dog." She froze, turned, then whispered something that no mic caught, but the look on her face said everything. She had lost, and she knew it. 3 weeks later, the lawsuit was dropped quietly. No apology, no admission, just a quiet retreat into obscurity. Kerren sold her house that month. No goodbye, no announcement, just a moving truck one morning and silence by nightfall. Her reign was over, and peace returned. Sophie laughed again in the yard, not loud but real. She chased a new puppy named Echo, a rescue, with ears too big and eyes full of mischief. She whispered to her. Sometimes said Daisy sent her to keep her safe. I believe it. The neighborhood changed too. Fences came down literally and figuratively. People talked more, smiled more, no longer afraid of fines or whispered threats. The HOA elected new leadership people who cared about community, not control. And me, I sat on the porch. One evening, watched Sophie run barefoot through the grass, Echo close behind the sky, gold and wide above them, and I thought about how close we came to breaking, how grief nearly drowned us, and how truth pulled us back. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a little girl smiling again because someone stood up. Sometimes it's a meme. Sometimes it's a quiet victory. And sometimes it's the sound of laughter where there used to be silence.